Hey everyone, welcome to this week's bonus episode. I want to start off by reminding everyone of the extraordinarily devastating and important story of Kalief Browder. Kalief Browder was 16 years old when he was sent to Rikers Island, one of the worst prisons in America. Browder was charged with stealing a book bag. He spent 1,000 days awaiting trial, 700 of those days in solitary confinement, a child in solitary confinement. And this is, again, in Rikers Island, a notorious prison that is currently facing a massive number of lawsuits for sexual violence against inmates. And all of this went down because Kalief Browder was a Black child who refused to plead guilty for a crime that he did not commit. That trauma stayed with him, and in June 2016, he died by suicide at the age of 22. Kalief Browder is, of course, only one child's story in a country with the largest militarized prison system and prison population in the world, with over 2 million people currently incarcerated. And of course, the percentages of that population that are non-white are contrasted to the general population, as you can imagine, are very high. Of course, I don't want to get sidetracked here because we'll talk about this in future episodes, but that helps explain U.S. support for Israel's racist genocidal government. It's the same militarized prison culture there that exists here, which is why they call Gaza the largest open-air prison. And there's a militarized system of apartheid with IDF soldiers killing a record number of Palestinian children in recent years. That's why we've been saying on the show for weeks now, ceasefire now, ceasefire now. Terrell Starr, a Black man, visited the West Bank, has shared his stories of witnessing firsthand the apartheid system, witnessing firsthand a militarized Jim Crow South in the West Bank against Palestinians, terrorizing and pushing out that population. Then that's generational trauma. The Palestinians that remain in the country of Israel are descended from the generation that suffered in 1948 in the first war of the Nakba, and now that we're witnessing another Nakba. I did not expect to go so much into that. When you talk about Kalief Browder and then the news coming out of Gaza, it's impossible not to make that connection. I bring him up because his story is a shocking contrast to the breaking news this week that white male traitor to our country, Charles McGonigal, who the American public we trusted to keep us safe from the Russian mafia. Charles McGonigal was an FBI agent in charge of counterintelligence, in charge specifically protecting the American public, and instead he was on the Russian mafia's payroll. Charles McGonigal was sentenced this week to a measly 4 years in prison. 4 years in prison. And you know when he's going to get out, he's going to cash in, he's going to register as a foreign lobbyist, foreign agent, and openly serve the Russian mafia, like so many U.S. officials have done, including former director of the FBI, Louis Freeh, and so on. There's a long list. Go back to the Gaslit Nation transcripts for those names. It's just a revolving door of corruption, and why I'm always saying on the show, corruption is an industry. That's how we have to think about it. It's a racket. And even in the recent interview I just did with Jesse Eisinger, investigative journalist at ProPublica, he talks about the revolving door of the DOJ, what a racket it is. Corruption is a deep-seated, normalized industry. So Charles McGonigal, white male traitor, getting 4 years for weakening our democracy, weakening our national security by serving not just the Russian regime. He was on the payroll of the worst of the worst of the Russian mafia oligarch thugs, Oleg Deripaska, the thug that won the aluminum wars in the car bomb 1990s in Russia. Deripaska is extremely close to Putin. Deripaska is extremely close to longtime Kremlin operative in Ukraine, Paul Manafort, whose right-hand man is a known GRU agent, Konstantin Kilimnik. And all of this, like all the work of Charles McGonigal, the FBI being compromised, the New York FBI, I should say, the New York FBI being compromised, we saw that out in the open through their behavior, through all the leaking the New York FBI was doing in the press to do everything they could to hurt Hillary Clinton in 2016, to tip the scales in that extremely close election for Donald Trump in 2016. We saw that with Rudy Giuliani on Fox News, giddy, saying they had something up their sleeve. They had a big old October surprise. And that turned out to be the infamous James Comey letter, which analysis showed significantly tipped the election for Trump in the final hours of the 2016 election. That stupid James Comey letter was a big old fabricated, manufactured October surprise between right-wing Republicans in the House and the New York FBI getting up in arms because of confidential, Hillary Clinton emails found on devices owned by Anthony Weiner, who was married to longtime Clinton aide Huma Abedin. And that just set off a firestorm in the press, and it just made her look shady. And in stark, deliberate contrast to that, the New York Times publishes a front page story saying that the FBI saw no connection between Trump and Russia. Never mind, there's already reporting, extraordinarily credible reporting, drawing direct connection between Trump and Russia. Just the fact that Paul Manafort was managing his election was a smoking gun. Like, Paul Manafort was always the smoking gun of Russiagate. The Steele dossier, Christopher Steele being the spy that formerly ran the Russia desk for the UK, Christopher Steele in his infamous Steele dossier put Manafort center as a central node of connecting the Russian mafia in the East with the Trump campaign, with the Russian mafia in the West. There's all this reporting by then, and yet the New York Times, the so-called newspaper of record, comes out and just puts a lid on the thing. Really made people like me, who was sticking my neck out at the time, look insane by saying, no, Trump is mobbed up with the Russians. And the New York Times front page story, the FBI sees no connection between Trump and Russia. Well, who was their source? Was it Charles McGonigal? We need to know that. For the public record, we need to know that. Was it people around Charles McGonigal that are still in the New York FBI who need to go, who haven't been caught yet? A lot of questions there that remain unanswered. And Charles McGonigal has those answers. And he's going to go to prison for 4 years, serve his time, maybe get pardoned by Trump should Trump win again, and then cash out again in a very big way. So that's what we have to look forward to. I want to point out that Putin just did his big end of the year speech where he just runs his mouth and went on and on and on about how they're going to take all of Ukraine. They're not going to be stopped. His total invasion continues. He has his eyes set on specific cities. They're going to continue going all in. And as part of this effort of what's going to help Putin seize all of Ukraine, you have his close ally in the European Union, Viktor Orban, blocking much needed aid to Ukraine, European Union aid to Ukraine, as Ukraine heads into these critical winter months. And of course, aid to Ukraine has been slowed down. They needed this aid a long time ago. So Mike Johnson, who has his own dark money connections to the Russians, did his job for the Russians. This is all real. This is all happening. We have to stare this nightmare in the face in order to overcome it. That's what we're doing. Last night, Terrell Starr of the Black Diplomats podcast, who spends quite a bit of time in Ukraine covering the war there, he and I met with a group of Americans that have spent time volunteering or working in Ukraine who have plans to go back there to continue to help. And we brainstormed ways to really dig in our heels to overcome these fascist threats, to really get Ukraine the support it needs in the long haul. As part of those efforts, we're going to organize a fundraiser for Razum for Ukraine in New York City this February, March. If you are local, look out for that. That's going to be a very important community event, bringing our community of listeners together. And really, we're going to find some way to really energize people. Because, we've been here before. We've faced these homegrown fascist threats, united with these global fascist threats. We survived the 1930s and 1940s, the first go around. We're going to do it again. Our democracy is going to ultimately prevail. And it's when the going gets tough, it's when everything feels dark, that we really need to redouble our efforts and just link arms and refuse to turn away and just fight like hell for our shared freedom. That's what we're doing. Shared liberation for everyone. Terrell Starr is going to be back on the show this coming Tuesday. We're going to talk about the threats we're up against, both foreign and domestic, and how to overcome them. And this week, for the bonus episode, I have a special treat for our supporters at the Truth Teller level and higher on Patreon. It's my conversation with media historian Ray Gamache, a leading biographer of Gareth Jones, who shares timely insights into Gareth's own reporting into Nazi Germany. A reminder that Gareth wasn't only battling Stalin, as you see in my film, Mr. Jones, he was also battling Hitler. So the world was just chaos then, monsters empowering monsters and traitors here at home. And so I brought Ray on the show to learn those lessons specifically, to sort of get that shot of courage, moral courage, as we head into a critical year, 2024. To hear this full episode, subscribe to the show at the Truth Teller level or higher on Patreon by signing up at patreon.com/gaslit. That's patreon.com/gaslit. Thank you to everyone who supports the show. We'll see you for an all-new episode this coming Tuesday featuring Terrell. And to our supporters at the Democracy Defender level and higher on Patreon, send in your questions for our regular Q&As. We always look forward to hearing from you. Thank you to everyone who supports the show. We could not make Gaslit Nation without you. Hello, everyone. It's Andrea of Gaslit Nation. I am here with journalism professor Ray Gamache, who is the author of several books, including Gareth Jones on Assignment in Nazi Germany, 1933 to 1934. You know, if you've seen my film, Mr. Jones, which is a dramatic version based on the real-life hero, the independent Welsh investigative journalist Gareth Jones, who at a tender age of, he was a man for his generation, being in his late 20s. You're like an old man by then in the 1930s. During his late 20s, he set out to take on Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Russia. And that is what he did. And we're going to have this wonderful conversation grounding everyone in the life and times of Gareth Jones, because unfortunately, it's very similar to what we're living with now. You have economic instability, arguably on a much more destructive scale, because this was the Great Depression. You had, in the crash of the capitalism-caused global collapse of the Great Depression, you had the rise of fascism. You had the big social upheaval of the most exciting social experiment the world had ever seen, communism, with the Bolshevik Revolution. So you had these warring ideologies that were ripping apart Europe and replacing the vacuum of power left with the collapse of monarchies, the royal houses, the empires that no longer existed in the wake of the Great War that just destroyed everything. And in the wake, individuals caught up in the forces of history were trying to build a new future, competing on what it would look like. You're coming off of the rosy 1920s, the progressive era, where a lot of activists, community organizers, neighborhood organizers, activists of all kinds were taking matters in their own hands, building all new organizations. It was an extremely exciting time, a progressive time, a promising time, but it was also a time where humanity, the civilization as we knew it, was already entering into a period of staggering mass murder unlike the world had ever seen. So I'm going to turn now to our guest, Ray. So obviously I've covered quite a bit Gareth Jones reporting from Soviet Russia, but before that, he's reporting on the Nazis in Germany. And not only that, Germany is a country that he has a lot of affection for. German is one of the languages he speaks fluently. He's got old friends across Germany. He's taking lots of summer trips and so on there. So walk us through Gareth Jones in Germany and how he winds up in Nazi Germany or Germany on the cusp of Hitler's rise to power, and what that adventure, what that reporting looks like.
Sure. Gareth studied in Germany over the course of his academic career. And he makes a point of saying first in 1932, then in 33 and 34, his desire to make sure he visits Germany at least once a year, usually during the summer. And so he's able to do that. And he was fluent in German. It was one of the languages he worked at, while he was at Cambridge, as well as Russian. And his employment with David Lloyd George gave him the kind of access that the leaders of both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union wanted him to visit.
Just to clarify, David Lloyd George was the former World War I Prime Minister of Great Britain and a fellow Welshman.
Correct.
So there was this very close Welsh connection. And the great David Lloyd George, great statesman, saw Gareth as my boy. He was a mentor, like a father figure to Gareth that opened up a lot of halls of power for Gareth.
Absolutely. And I think the confusing part for people, it stems from this kind of duality that Jones had. On the one hand, being an aide, a foreign policy expert for David Lloyd George, as well as, trying to establish himself as a journalist.
Journalism is a very tough industry to break into, even back then, because when you're a stringer, when you're a freelancer, who's going to pay your bills? So Gareth worked a day job being this foreign affairs advisor for a powerful statesman in London.
Right. He had spent part of the summer of 1929, after he had completed his degree at Cambridge, working for the London Times. And it was there that they put him on the Russian desk. And so he was rewriting copy from their correspondent. And that lasted for, I think, 6 to 8 weeks. At the end of that, they recommended that he work for a regional newspaper before, trying to join an established paper like the Times. And so they kind of shunted him off. And that's when the offer from Lloyd George came. And so he starts working for him early in 1930. That really was a major break for him, because Lloyd George, happily sends him off first to the Soviet Union in 1930. He ends up going again in August of 1931, this time with the American businessman Jack Hines II, who had just graduated from Cambridge, and he takes Hines into the Soviet Union unaccompanied for the most part, and they travel by themselves. And there are some really interesting photographs from that trip that I have seen at the archives in Pittsburgh. And then Jones goes back in 1932 to Great Britain. He starts working for Lloyd George again. And by the end of the year, he's made the determination that he will travel to Nazi Germany and then the Soviet Union, two-part series of newspapers of articles for the Western Mail that he calls "A Welshman Looks at Europe."
And the Western Mail is the newspaper of Wales.
Correct. And as you mentioned in your introduction, this fact-finding mission to both those competing ideologies was his number one goal at the beginning of 1933. There's no question about that.
It was the story. So Berlin and Moscow were exotic, exciting international hotspots. People flocked to these cities because of how avant-garde and innovative they were. And the fact that Jones spent time, as he did in Germany, a lot of people of his generation spent a lot of time in Germany. And one of the reasons why Ray and I are having this conversation is because it's the 90th anniversary of the Holodomor, Stalin's genocide famine in Ukraine. And I wanted to also highlight his work. Also, unfortunately, with the ongoing genocide, Russia's genocide in Ukraine, which Russia is refusing to give up, that's Russian imperialism. That's what happens when you have dictatorship. You have to create a forever war to distract the home front and create all sorts of enemies, internal and external and so on, to have that totalitarian control. And that's what Putin's stuck in until he dies. He's trying to be like any dictator and die in power. And as the war continues, as it unfortunately drags on, you're going to have useful idiots in the West, whether they realize they're a useful idiot or not, with these cynical disinformation attention grabs where they cynically try to get attention for themselves, where they try to get their name in print by taking some very disturbing, unethical, contrarian positions. And unfortunately, because Gareth Jones happened to be a journalist, bouncing around Nazi Germany, reporting on the Nazis, charming his way through the front door of Nazi Germany, as he did in the Soviet Union, as you see in my film, Mr. Jones. Like, he charms his way in with the Soviets. He leads them by the nose to get the access he needs to report the story. He was a hustler through and through. He had swagger. He knew how to put on a good game. A lot of journalists are like that. And I can assure you, the number one rule of media training, and Ray may agree with me as a professor of journalism, never trust a journalist. Always be careful what you say in front of them, even if it's a throwaway comment. If it's a good story, they will use it. I was at a brunch with a bunch of journalists, editors at the major mainstream power outlets. And the question came up, would you ever let yourself be interviewed by another journalist? The entire table said no. Why would all these journalists refuse to? Because they know that the journalist is a shark. They're after a good story. They're after something that is going to get attention for themselves, make a name for themselves, and build their name, build their power. Gareth is a different kind of journalist because he saw something he could not unsee, and that was his trek in Ukraine, which Ray covers in another book, all about Gareth's time in the Soviet Union, which is a must-read book, which I've read. And Gareth sees the famine, the devastation of the man-made famine. He's the first to call it a man-made famine, and that's when he's like, enough. And he risks his life and career to report article after article, gets blacklisted by David Lloyd George, has to move back to a small town in Wales. He gets stuck in this, writing cultural stories and all of that. Those beats are historically accurate. You see them in my film. I know I'm jumping the gun here and I'm interviewing myself at this point, Ray, but I think all of this framing is really important to understand also why we're having this conversation, because unfortunately, Gareth Jones is being victimized, and we're here also to fact check the truth, to basically make a stake of what's real, what's not. And Ray, I will now let you continue.
Why journalists don't want to be interviewed by other journalists, perhaps, is you lose control of the narrative, right? I mean, whatever information you provide as a source, how that is then going to be represented, it's out of your hands, right? And so the idea of controlling the narrative, it becomes really important. We see it today in terms of support for Ukraine, or, you're talking about a war against Russia. Russia can't lose. These competing narratives, we see the parallels certainly in the 1930s, where again, especially in regards to what happens in Ukraine in 1932 and 33, as reported by Jones, but also by a number of other journalists. Ray Gamache, for example, is thrown out of the Soviet Union in September of 1932 because she has reported on mass starvation conditions. Others as well. Before Jones comes back from his trek through Ukraine, through some of the Holcos, the state farms, as well as the collective farms, and he reports what he has seen, the devastation. Jones, acting as a source, does wonders because he speaks to reporters stationed in Germany, right? So they're in Berlin. There are far more foreign correspondents stationed in Berlin than there are in Moscow. And many people fail to understand that's where the center was. London, Berlin, Moscow. There were no foreign correspondents until 1921. And only as a result of the relief agency, right, that Hoover started to help mollify the famine that had occurred in 1921-22. It's only because of the ARA, the American Relief Administration, a condition of which you're going to, right, allow Western journalists into the Soviet Union, and the Soviets have to relent, and that's how we have our first Western correspondents in Moscow. And they have to renew every 6 months. Well, the Soviets use that, right, reapplication process to weed out anyone like Ray Gamache
Paul Sheffer.
Paul Sheffer, thank you. He's denied re-entry, and even Durante is threatened after he reports as early as November 1932 that this harvest is in tatters. That's the censorship that they faced in Moscow, whereas in Berlin, all the Western correspondents gathered at this one restaurant called La Taverna. Jones goes there with a list of the journalists he wants to speak to. And he interviews several of them while he's there. And they're all doing the same thing that he is, courting the Nazis to get access to information and stories in terms of what their agenda is going to become, which we discovered quite quickly in early 1933. As soon as they call for the boycott of Jewish businesses, which Jones reports on.